Silence, the mirror that makes men face themselves. You will think of silence as emptiness. A void. A space between words where nothing happens. But what if I told you that silence is not absence, it is revelation? That when a woman falls silent, it is not because she has nothing to say, but because she has finally decided that her energy will no longer be spent explaining her worth to those who cannot see it. When a woman withdraws her voice, the world around her begins to tremble. The man who once felt safe in the echo of her affection suddenly finds himself standing in front of a mirror he never asked for, the mirror of her silence. And in that mirror, he sees not her absence, but his own reflection, fragmented, insecure, and unbearably naked. Silence is not passive. It is an active force, a psychological storm disguised as stillness. It's the moment when the anima, the feminine aspect within the man's psyche, retreats into the depths of his unconscious, forcing him to face the barren landscape left behind. Her silence calls forth his shadow, the part of him he has long buried under pride, desire, and denial. It is here, in this confrontation, that he either grows or crumbles. Most men mistake her withdrawal for indifference. They do not understand that silence is a language older than words, one spoken by the soul when reason fails. It is the archetypal feminine, the high priestess, turning inward, guarding her inner temple. In mythology, this is the moment when Persephone descends into the underworld, leaving the earth barren so that Demeter may learn what absence truly means. In modern love, it is the moment when a woman stops trying to fix, heal, or justify. She simply vanishes into herself, and her energy becomes a mirror in which every man must meet his own truth. For a man who lives disconnected from his inner world, her silence feels like rejection. But for the man who dares to see beyond appearances, it becomes a sacred initiation. He begins to sense that what he misses is not her presence, but the reflection of himself that she once offered. When she spoke, her words gave him warmth, validation, and direction. Now, her silence exposes the emptiness within him. It is as if the music stopped and he must finally listen to the sound of his own heartbeat. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Silence does precisely that. It strips away the noise and forces confrontation with what we fear most, our inner void. A man, left alone with a silent woman, begins to wrestle with his projections. The goddess he adored fades, and he begins to see the mortal he had never learned to love, himself. For centuries, women have been taught that silence is submission. Yet the deeper truth is far more potent. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes sovereignty. It is the moment when a woman steps beyond reaction, beyond emotional chaos, into a place of self-mastery. Her quiet is not weakness, it is power distilled to its purest form. A man feels it as an ache, a haunting absence. He might try to provoke her into speaking again, through anger, manipulation, or charm. But the silence that comes from awakening cannot be undone. It is not a weapon but a boundary. It says, without words, I have seen too much. I have learned too deeply. I no longer belong to the illusion. The silence of a conscious woman is magnetic because it does not beg, it invites. It invites reflection, growth, and accountability. Her stillness becomes a mirror through which a man must learn to see his own shadow, not to blame her for it, but to understand why he ever needed her light to feel whole. And here lies the paradox: silence hurts because it reveals. It reveals the unspoken dependencies, the unconscious games of control, the emotional hunger that hides beneath pride. When she stops explaining, he begins to hear himself, his defensiveness, his fear, his longing. Every unanswered message, every unreturned gaze becomes a sermon in self-awareness. In Jungian terms, this is the confrontation with the Anima's withdrawal. The external feminine pulls back so that the inner feminine within the man can emerge. The silence of a woman is the call of his soul, urging him to descend into his own depths. If he resists, he will project, blaming her, resenting her, chasing her shadow. But if he listens, truly listens, he will begin to integrate. He will learn that love cannot be possessed, that validation cannot be demanded, and that silence can teach him what words never could: humility. For the woman, silence is not a punishment, it is purification. It is the sacred pause between death and rebirth. When she no longer seeks to be understood, she becomes untouchable. Her silence no longer echoes with pain but with presence. It is the sound of returning home to herself. And for the man, this silence is both a loss and a lesson, a mirror so clear it burns. In the stillness that follows her withdrawal, something ancient stirs in the air. The world around him feels altered, though nothing visible has changed. Her silence expands like a tide, flooding every corner of his mind. It presses on him in the quiet hours, in the moments between distractions, in the echoes of conversations that no longer happen. It is as if her absence has rearranged the atmosphere itself, no longer filled with her laughter, her warmth, her soft corrections that once made him feel seen. Now, all that remains is reflection. Silence is the great revealer. It dismantles illusions, one by one. In its presence, masks crumble. The man who wants to find himself through her attention begins to see the fragility of his own identity. What he called confidence was often validation borrowed from her eyes. What he mistook for strength was sustained by her understanding. Without her energy to absorb and reflect his emotions, he encounters himself as he truly is, uncertain, restless, seeking meaning in the void she left behind. This is the confrontation Jung described when he spoke of the shadow, the dark, unacknowledged part of the psyche that we project onto others. While she was there, her light softened his edges. Now, in her absence, the shadow emerges in full. He may grow angry, accusing her of coldness, of detachment, of cruelty. But what he truly rages against is not her silence, it is the mirror she has become. For every man must eventually face the truth that no woman can complete what he refuses to meet within himself. In mythology, this is the initiation every hero must endure. The goddess withdraws, the light fades, and the man must descend into his own underworld. It is not a punishment but a passage. The silence of the feminine is the closing of one door so that another, deeper, darker, more honest, may open. And in that descent, he begins to learn what love without possession truly means. Her silence becomes an alchemy. It turns chaos into clarity. It reveals the invisible threads that once tied her energy to his self-worth. Every attempt to reach her, every restless question, why won't she speak? Does she still care? What did I do wrong? Becomes part of his initiation. Because silence, unlike rejection, does not provide closure. It leaves space, dangerous, sacred space, where transformation can occur. Meanwhile, the woman who chooses silence enters a different journey. At first, her quiet may feel heavy, filled with grief, like the echo of a temple after the candles are blown out. Yet within that quiet, a light begins to return, one that does not flicker in response to others but burns steadily from within. The silence becomes her sanctuary. She begins to understand that peace is not found in being heard, but in no longer needing to speak in order to be understood. It is through silence that the feminine reclaims her mystery. The modern world often demands performance, constant communication, explanation, availability. But the archetypal feminine is not meant to be consumed, she is meant to be felt, intuited, revered. Her silence is not a void to be filled, it is a sacred pause that demands reverence. In that space, she remembers her wholeness. She realizes that her power was never in the words she spoke, but in the energy she carried even when she said nothing. A conscious woman's silence holds gravity. It does not chase or punish, it teaches. It teaches that intimacy cannot exist without awareness, that love without depth is merely dependency, and that attention without respect is noise. Her silence draws boundaries where words could only plead. It whispers a truth every soul must eventually learn, that peace begins the moment one stops explaining oneself to those unwilling to listen. And so, the man who once took her presence for granted begins to awaken. Perhaps slowly, perhaps painfully. He starts to see that her silence was not rejection, but reflection. It was the mirror in which he was invited to meet himself. Some will turn away, unable to bear the sight. Others will stay, allowing the discomfort to become their teacher. And those who truly listen will begin to understand the feminine silence is not a wall, it is an initiation into consciousness. Through this initiation, both are transformed. The man learns humility and self-awareness. The woman learns detachment and sovereignty. Together, though perhaps apart, they serve each other's growth, not through noise, but through the profound intelligence of silence. The Stoics knew this truth well. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." Silence reveals that color. It shows who we are when no one is feeding our ego, when no voice echoes our worth back to us. It strips the noise of affirmation until what remains is essence, unembellished, unprotected, undeniable. And that is why silence is not the end of connection, but the beginning of truth. It does not destroy, it exposes. It is not the absence of love, but its evolution. There comes a point when the silence no longer feels like loss, it begins to feel like clarity. The woman who once poured her energy into being understood now recognizes the futility of explaining herself to those who listen only to reply. She begins to see that words can be cages, binding her to the emotional noise of others. Silence, instead, becomes her liberation. It is the moment when she realizes that her peace is not something anyone else can give or take. In this stillness, she learns to listen differently, to her intuition, to the subtle shifts within her body, to the voice of the unconscious that speaks through dreams and sensations. Silence becomes her teacher, a vessel through which she meets the most authentic version of herself. And with every breath unspoken, she grows stronger. The silence is no longer something she must endure, it becomes something she chooses, something she wears like a cloak of sovereignty. When Jung wrote about individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, he spoke of the necessity of withdrawal, of turning inward to integrate what has been projected outward. For the feminine psyche, this often means reclaiming energy once spent nurturing, fixing, or proving. The woman who learns to be silent does not shut the world out, she simply refuses to let the world drown her out. She moves through life with a quiet intensity, no longer trying to be palatable or understood. Her silence becomes a form of spiritual discipline, a devotion to the parts of her that require no validation. Men often misinterpret this phase. They see her detachment as coldness, her calm as indifference. Yet if they could look deeper, they would see that this stillness is sacred ground, a space where she gathers the fragments of herself that were scattered through years of overgiving. Her silence is not a wall, but a chrysalis. She is not gone, she is transforming. For the man, this silence can be unbearable, for it dismantles the illusions upon which his self-image once rested. The noise of relationship, the arguments, the reassurances, the drama, used to keep him from hearing his own inner disquiet. Now, with the sound gone, he must face the truth that his sense of control was always an illusion. The silence presses on him like gravity, forcing him inward, forcing him to see that what he misses most is not her voice, but the reflection of himself he once found in her attention. It is in this quiet confrontation that something new can be born, if he allows it. If he listens deeply enough, beneath the anxiety and the pride, he may begin to hear the whisper of his own anima, the inner feminine that he has long neglected. She speaks softly, through intuition and longing. She tells him that love cannot be sustained by possession, that presence is more powerful than pursuit, and that silence, if embraced, can purify the heart. Yet few men can endure this mirror for long. Many will try to fill the void with distractions, new faces, new noise, anything to drown out the sound of themselves. They do not realize that every external pursuit is merely a repetition of the same pattern, a flight from the self. Until a man learns to sit within silence, to face his reflection without needing someone else to complete it, he remains divided, caught between desire and denial. For the woman, silence is where she returns to her essence. The more she inhabits it, the more she radiates an aura that words cannot replicate. It is a quiet strength, felt rather than seen, a magnetism born not from performance but from presence. She moves differently. She speaks only when necessary, and her words carry the weight of self-knowledge. Men feel this power instinctively. Some are drawn to it, others are unsettled by it. Because true feminine silence does not invite rescue, it challenges perception. It forces the masculine to evolve or retreat. In ancient philosophy, the Stoics believed that mastery begins where reactivity ends. To respond, not react. To remain centered amidst chaos. The silent woman embodies this principle in its purest form. She does not suppress her emotions, she transcends them. Her silence is not emptiness, it is discipline. It is the moment when she no longer allows temporary noise to disrupt eternal stillness. Through this transformation, she becomes her own mirror. No longer defined by how others see her, she begins to see herself clearly, her strength, her tenderness, her boundaries, her brilliance. The silence becomes a sanctuary where she rebuilds from truth, not from trauma. She no longer chases love, she cultivates it within. And while the world may not understand this kind of quiet, those who have met their own shadows will recognize it immediately. It is the silence of a woman who has faced the storm and chosen peace over validation. It is the quiet of someone who has nothing to prove, nothing to fear, and nothing left to lose but illusions. Her silence, once misunderstood as distance, now becomes divine presence. And in that presence, everything begins to shift. There is a moment, almost imperceptible, when silence turns from stillness into revelation. It no longer feels like something missing, it feels like truth unveiled. For the woman who has entered this sacred space, silence ceases to be about anyone else. It is no longer about what he did, what he didn't say, or whether he still looks back. It becomes a mirror so clear that it reflects everything, every wound, every attachment, every false identity she once wore in the name of love. And as she sees herself fully, she finally begins to see the world as it truly is. This is the stage of awakening, when silence transforms into wisdom. In Jungian psychology, this is where the self emerges, the archetype of wholeness that lives beyond the ego, beyond the need to be desired or validated. The woman who arrives here does not just withdraw, she transcends. She moves beyond the polarity of masculine and feminine reaction, beyond pain and pride, into the deeper truth of being. Her silence no longer reflects absence, it radiates presence. She becomes the observer. She watches the dance of projection unfold, the man projecting his longing, his guilt, his unresolved shadows, while she stands still, rooted in self-awareness. Where she once felt the urge to explain or to heal, she now feels compassion without entanglement. Because she understands that everyone, in their own way, is at war with their reflection. The man runs from silence because it exposes his emptiness. The woman embraces silence because it teaches her fullness. Both are mirrors to each other's evolution. Silence, in this form, becomes the teacher that words never could. It demands surrender, not as defeat, but as revelation. When the noise fades, what remains is essence. No performance, no pretension, just truth. And in that truth, the woman realizes something profound: love cannot be truly known through pursuit or persuasion. It can only be known through awareness. Through the understanding that everything we chase externally is a reflection of what we have yet to integrate internally. In the mythic sense, this is the feminine's return to the temple. She rediscovers the ancient knowing that every woman carries in her bones, that silence is her original language. Before words, before logic, there was intuition. There was feeling. There was knowing without needing to prove. Modern life has tried to strip that away, to convince her that she must speak louder to be heard. But now she knows, the more she speaks, the more her truth gets diluted. The more she explains, the more her soul gets exhausted. So she stops. Not out of bitterness, but out of reverence. And something miraculous happens when a woman stops chasing noise. The world begins to adjust to her frequency. She no longer vibrates to the frantic rhythm of external validation. Her energy becomes still, magnetic, sovereign. She attracts not through effort, but through alignment. This is not manipulation, it is resonance. When she is quiet within, her silence calls forth only those who can meet her there. For the man, this silence remains a test, a sacred mirror that does not flatter. He must choose what to do with it. He can run from it, filling his days with distractions, or he can sit in it and learn. Those who choose to learn begin to see that the silence is not an enemy but a teacher. It shows him that love is not ownership, that intimacy is not constant access, that the feminine is not a source of emotional comfort but a call to consciousness. Her silence asks him, "Can you see me without needing me to soothe you? Can you love me without needing to control me? Can you hear me even when I do not speak?" And if he cannot, if he retreats into his ego, into the comfort of noise, then the silence will become distance. But if he allows it to humble him, if he listens to what the quiet reveals, something shifts. He begins to sense his own depth. He begins to integrate the anima within, the inner feminine he once sought outside of himself. And through that, he becomes whole. For both, silence is the bridge between illusion and truth. It dismantles the idea of control and replaces it with reverence. The woman learns that she was never meant to convince anyone of her worth. The man learns that love cannot thrive without awareness. Silence is the crucible where both are refined. In Stoic thought, Seneca once wrote, "To be calm is the highest achievement of the self." And in this stillness, the woman finally understands that peace is not a reaction, it is her nature. She no longer needs to prove, persuade, or perform. Her silence speaks louder than any declaration of love could. It says, "I have seen myself. I have faced my shadow. I am whole." And when she reaches this level of stillness, something extraordinary happens. She no longer seeks to be understood, she becomes understanding itself. She no longer desires to be chosen, she realizes she is the chooser. Her silence ceases to be about the man or the past, it becomes the symphony of her rebirth. It is not emptiness. It is arrival.